Hold up. I'm hearing some crime sound going on BigL analysis. You know what? We screencast your guy to see what's going on in LA right now.
In the late 1970s, the city of Atlanta was experiencing a moment of pride and optimism that few cities in the American South had ever seen before. To many people across the country, Atlanta represented progress. It was a city that seemed to be moving forward while much of the South was still struggling with the legacy of its past. Businesses were arriving, neighborhoods were expanding, and the skyline itself was slowly rising higher with each passing year. New office towers were appearing downtown. The airport was becoming one of the busiest transportation hubs in the world. And city leaders often spoke confidently about Atlanta's future, describing it as a place where opportunity and ambition could thrive together. But beyond the bright lights of the city center, life in many neighborhoods was very different. Families worked hard, often juggling multiple jobs just to keep up with rising costs. Children played outside in the afternoons while their parents worked long hours. It was a normal part of daily life, something that had existed for generations. And for a long time, no one imagined that these same quiet streets, these same neighborhoods filled with children riding bicycles and laughing on playgrounds, would soon become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in American history. Because somewhere in the city, hidden among millions of ordinary people, someone was beginning to commit crimes that would change Atlanta forever. The first signs that something was wrong did not arrive with sirens or breaking news alerts. Instead, they appeared quietly, almost unnoticed at first. On July 21, 1979, a 14-year-old boy named Edward Hope Smith left his home to run a small errand for his mother. It was the kind of everyday responsibility that children take on without much thought. A quick walk down the street, perhaps a stop at a nearby store, and then a short trip back home. But Edward never returned. At first, his family assumed he had simply gotten distracted. Maybe he had stopped to talk with friends, or perhaps he had wandered off to play somewhere nearby. These kinds of delays were not unusual for young teenagers. But as the hours passed and night slowly settled over the neighborhood, worry began to grow. His family started calling neighbors. They checked nearby parks and streets. They asked friends if anyone had seen him. No one had. What had begun as a small concern was slowly becoming something far more frightening. Days later, the search ended with a discovery that no family ever wants to face. Edward's body was found in a wooded area not far from where he lived. The community was devastated. But even then, investigators believed the tragedy might be an isolated crime. They had no idea that this was only the beginning. Only days after Edward's death shocked the community, another boy disappeared. He was just 13 years old. Like Edward, Alfred had simply stepped outside one day. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses who could explain what had happened. One moment he was there, living the normal life of a teenager in Atlanta. The next moment, he had vanished without a trace. His family immediately reported him missing, hoping that maybe he had run away or that some misunderstanding had occurred. But deep down, many feared the worst. And soon, those fears were confirmed. Alfred's body was discovered not long afterward. 2 children, 2 tragedies, both occurring within a short time and within the same general area of the city. Still, authorities hesitated to connect the cases. At the time, missing children investigations did not always receive the immediate attention they might today. Investigators often believed that young people who disappeared had simply run away from home. But parents in the community were beginning to notice something unsettling. 2 boys had disappeared. Both had been found dead, and the circumstances surrounding their deaths were disturbingly similar. A quiet fear was beginning to spread. As the months passed, what once felt like isolated tragedies began to take on a far more disturbing meaning. More children were disappearing across Atlanta. At first, each case was treated on its own. Different streets, different neighborhoods, different families. On paper, there was nothing that clearly connected them, but on the ground, something didn't feel right. Investigators began to notice small similarities, details that, on their own, might have meant nothing. But together, they began forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Most of the victims were boys. Many of them were between 9 and 16 years old, children standing at the fragile edge between childhood and adolescence. And almost all of them came from working-class African-American communities. These were neighborhoods where families worked hard, where children were known by name, where streets were familiar and routine felt safe. Which made what was happening even more unsettling, because these children were not disappearing in strange or unfamiliar places. They were vanishing from their own streets, from the same sidewalks they walked every day, from the same routes they had taken dozens of times before. One boy stepped out to buy something from a nearby store and never came back. Another left home on his bicycle, riding through streets he knew by heart, and was never seen again. Some simply went outside to play and disappeared into silence. And then, the discoveries began. Bodies started to appear. Some were found in quiet wooded areas, far from busy roads. Others were discovered near abandoned buildings, places most people avoided. In several cases, victims were found near rivers and creeks that cut through the city, their presence raising more questions than answers. Each discovery felt heavier than the last. Each one confirmed what many had begun to fear, but could barely say out loud. This was not random. This was not coincidence. Something deliberate was happening. And with every new victim, the fear tightened its grip on the community. Parents who once trusted their neighborhoods without question now watched every movement, every stranger, every passing car. Because for the first time, something terrifying had become clear. There was a pattern, and no one knew when or where it would strike next. By 1980, the fear had spread beyond individual neighborhoods. It had taken hold of the entire city. Across Atlanta, daily life began to change in ways that no one could ignore. Playgrounds that once rang with laughter now sat in silence. Swings moved gently in the wind, untouched. Basketball courts stood empty, their echoes replaced by an uneasy stillness. Parents no longer felt safe letting their children walk alone. Not to school, not to the store, not even down the block. Simple routines that had once defined childhood were suddenly seen as risks. After sunset, entire streets seemed to shut down. Doors were locked earlier. Curtains were drawn tighter. Families stayed indoors, holding on to a sense of safety that felt increasingly fragile. Children who had once grown up exploring their neighborhoods freely were now given strict instructions. Stay inside, stay close, don't go anywhere alone. And as fear grew, so did frustration. Community meetings became packed with anxious parents, local leaders, and residents searching desperately for answers. Voices were raised, emotions ran high. Grief, anger, and fear blended into something overwhelming. Many began to question whether enough was being done. Some believed the early disappearances had not been treated with the urgency they deserved. Others felt their communities had been overlooked for too long. The pressure on law enforcement intensified with each passing week. Eventually, the investigation expanded on a massive scale. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the case. Federal agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, were brought in to assist. It became one of the largest and most complex investigations the country had ever seen. Thousands of leads were followed. Countless interviews were conducted. But despite the effort, despite the manpower, despite the urgency, the one thing everyone needed remained out of reach. The person responsible was still out there, unseen, unidentified. And, most frightening of all, still able to move through the city without being caught. By 1981, investigators were searching for anything, any detail that might finally bring them closer to the truth. And then, a pattern within the pattern began to emerge. Several victims had been discovered in or near rivers. At first, it seemed like coincidence, but as the cases were reviewed more closely, the possibility became harder to ignore. What if the killer was using the water to dispose of evidence? What if the rivers themselves were part of the method? It was a theory that couldn't be proven immediately, but it was strong enough to act on. So police began quietly watching bridges across the city. Night after night, officers waited in the darkness, observing passing vehicles, listening carefully, hoping for anything out of the ordinary. For weeks, nothing happened. Just the sound of cars passing, the steady flow of water below, the slow passage of time. Then, one night in May of 1981, something broke the silence. A sudden sound, a loud splash from the river below. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in the quiet stillness of the night. Officers immediately reacted. Within moments, they noticed a car moving away from the bridge. It wasn't speeding, it wasn't trying to escape, but something about its timing felt wrong. The officers stopped the vehicle. Inside was a young man, 23 years old, calm, composed. His name was Wayne Williams. At that moment, there was no clear evidence tying him to the murders. No immediate proof. No direct link. Just a man, on a bridge, at a suspicious time. But sometimes, in investigations like this, everything changes with a single moment. And this moment would turn out to be one of the most important in the entire case. In the months that followed, investigators began focusing more closely on Wayne Williams. What had started as a routine stop slowly evolved into the center of the entire investigation. Evidence began to build, not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in small, technical details. Fibers, microscopic traces collected from victims that appeared to match materials from Williams' home and car. Individually, each piece might not have meant much, but together, they formed a narrative that prosecutors believed was strong enough to present in court. In 1982, Wayne Williams was arrested, but in a decision that surprised many, he was not charged with the deaths of the children. Instead, he was tried for the murders of 2 adult victims connected to the case. The trial quickly became a national event. Reporters from across the country arrived in Atlanta, documenting every detail, every argument, every moment inside the courtroom. Families of the victims watched closely, hoping, finally, for answers, for closure. After weeks of testimony, expert analysis, and intense debate, the jury reached its verdict. Wayne Williams was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. Soon after, authorities made a declaration that would shape the legacy of the case. They announced that the Atlanta child murders had been solved. Most of the cases were officially closed. But for many families, closure never came. Questions remained, doubts lingered, and even decades later, the case continues to spark debate. Because sometimes, a verdict brings an ending, and sometimes, it only marks the beginning of deeper questions about what really happened and whether the full truth was ever truly uncovered.